A 9-year-old Yazidi girl named Nadia Murad stood frozen as ISIS fighters stormed her village. Armed men shouted orders, dragging families from their homes. She watched in horror as her mother was torn away, pushed aside like she was nothing. Moments later, Nadia and dozens of other children were forced onto a bus. Their cries filled the air, but no one came to help. Her childhood ended that day. What awaited her was not random cruelty. It was part of a system designed with precision, a system so organized, so methodical, that the United Nations later called it genocide. But what ISIS did in the 21st century was not new. It was the continuation of an ancient practice, one that had been written into law, repeated across empires, and justified as divine. For more than 14 centuries, Islamic conquests institutionalized sexual slavery, captured women and children, became commodities. Their bodies were claimed as spoils, their identities erased. From the first caliphs to the Ottoman sultans, and finally to ISIS, the pattern remained the same. This was not an accident of war. It was policy. It was law. And yet, much of this story has been ignored, dismissed, or softened in history books. The evidence is overwhelming. It lives in chronicles, in court documents, in the memories of survivors, and it demands to be told. From the very birth of the Caliphates, sexual slavery was not hidden in the shadows. It was written into the framework of law and faith. The Quran contained verses that legitimized the taking of women as spoils of war. One verse, 4:24, permitted relations with women captured in battle. Another, 33-50, referred to those held by the right hand as possessions granted by God. These were not isolated lines. They became the foundation for centuries of Islamic jurisprudence. Clerics and jurists used them to craft detailed rules. Rules that decided how many captives could be taken. Rules that described how they could be divided among soldiers. Rules that allowed them to be bought, sold, or gifted like livestock. The women and children taken in conquest were classified as sabaya. That word meant captives, but in practice, it meant property. They had no right to refuse. They had no right to freedom. Their value was reduced to age, beauty, and fertility. The most attractive were given to caliphs and commanders. Others were distributed to soldiers as rewards. Still more were sold in markets, where buyers examined them like animals. Religion did not condemn this system. Religion justified it. It was presented not as exploitation, but as divine law. And once written into law, it became almost impossible to challenge. This made sexual slavery not an occasional crime of war, but a permanent institution across Islamic empires. Once captured, women and children were funneled into markets. These were not hidden places. They were central to the economy of Islamic empires. In cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, slave markets operated openly. Travelers described streets filled with rows of captives. Young women stood exposed while buyers inspected them. Teeth were checked. Skin was examined. Virginity was tested, often through invasive and humiliating methods. Children were separated from their families and sold individually. The most beautiful were marked for caliphs or high-ranking officials. Those judged less desirable were sold in bulk, destined for brothels or labor. Every transaction was recorded like business. Receipts listed names, ages, and prices, as though they were livestock. Taxes were collected by the state, ensuring profit flowed back to the treasury. For merchants, it was one of the most lucrative trades in the Islamic world. For rulers, it was a way to reward loyalty and display wealth. For the captives, it was degradation beyond words. They were stripped of their identity. They were stripped of their dignity, and they were turned into commodities to be bought and sold. Markets of flesh thrived for centuries, not as isolated crimes, but as organized institutions sanctioned by both law and religion. For many captives, the slave market was not the end of their journey. The youngest and most beautiful were selected for the harems of rulers. To foreign visitors, harems were often imagined as places of mystery and luxury. But for the women inside, they were gilded cages. Every harem was organized like a fortress. Thick walls and locked gates ensured no one could leave without permission. Armed eunuchs patrolled the corridors, guarding both entrances and women. These eunuchs were boys castrated before puberty. Most did not survive the operation. Those who did lived in pain, condemned to serve as jailers over women they could never touch. Inside, the women were trained for obedience. They learned to sing, dance, and play instruments to entertain their masters. They were taught courtly manners, but these lessons masked their real purpose. Their bodies were their currency. Every woman was ranked. Those who caught the ruler's eye could gain small privileges, sometimes wealth or political influence. Those who failed to please were beaten, humiliated, or discarded. Even young girls were not spared. Children as young as 12 were groomed and prepared for the ruler's bed. Pregnancy changed everything. A woman who bore a son could rise in status, becoming powerful within the harem. But others remained nameless concubines, forgotten the moment they lost favor. There was no escape. Attempts to resist or flee often ended in torture or death. For some, suicide was the only way out. The harem, often romanticized in art and legend, was in reality a system of control, fear, and exploitation. It turned women into possessions, stripped of freedom, and bound to lives of silence. The Ottoman Empire expanded the system of human capture with one of its most feared policies. It was called the Devshirme, or the collection. Every few years, Ottoman officials swept through Christian villages in the Balkans. They demanded that families surrender their sons. Boys, as young as 4, were torn from their mothers' arms. Parents wept, begged, and resisted, but refusal meant death. Some villages mutilated their children to make them unfit for service. Others hid them in forests and caves, praying they would not be found. But the Ottoman system was relentless. Children were marched away in groups, guarded by soldiers. They were forced to convert to Islam. Their names were changed, their past erased. The strongest and most intelligent were sent to elite schools. Some became administrators or soldiers in the empire's service. The best fighters were forged into the janissaries, the sultan's most loyal troops. But loyalty came at a terrible cost. They were forbidden to return to their families. They were trained to see their old lives as enemies. The Devshirme was not just about building an army. It was about breaking communities. By stealing their children, the Ottomans made sure conquered peoples would never fully recover. Every raid left scars, not only on the boys taken, but on the families destroyed. For the empire, it was an efficient system of control. For the victims, it was a wound that lasted for generations. Across the Islamic world, slave markets became powerful engines of profit. They were not secret places hidden from society. They stood at the very center of major cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus. Merchants openly advertised their human wares. Women stood half-naked, displayed for potential buyers. Men prodded their bodies, checked their teeth, and examined their skin. Virginity tests were carried out in the open. Children were separated from mothers and sold to different owners. Price tags were determined by age, beauty, and health. A young girl of extraordinary beauty could fetch a fortune. Less desirable women were sold in groups, destined for brothels or household labor. Every sale was documented. Receipts listed names, ages, and origins. Taxes were collected by officials, ensuring that the state profited from every transaction. Markets functioned like modern shopping centers. Buyers browsed rows of captives, as if choosing goods. Slave traders built entire networks across Africa, Europe, and Asia to supply demand. Captured women from the Caucasus, Georgia, and Eastern Europe were especially prized. The markets operated for centuries, generation after generation. They were treated not as crimes but as pillars of the economy. For rulers, they meant wealth and power. For merchants, they meant endless profit. For the captives, they meant the destruction of their lives. In these markets of flesh, humanity itself was turned into currency. The system of slavery did not end with capture or sale. It extended into the most private parts of a woman's life. Female captives were often forced into breeding programs. Owners paired them with chosen men, not for love but for profit. Children born from these unions were automatically slaves if the mother remained in bondage. Their value was measured from birth. Boys were trained for labor or for the army. Girls were raised to serve in households, harems, or to be sold again. Mothers had no right to their children. Babies could be taken away at any moment. Some women were forced to bear child after child until their bodies broke. Those who could no longer conceive were considered worthless and discarded. Pregnancy inside harems was carefully monitored. A concubine who bore a son could rise in status, sometimes gaining real influence. But for most, motherhood only meant deeper chains. Children themselves became commodities in a cycle of generational slavery. Families were deliberately destroyed. Identity, culture, and lineage were erased. The system ensured that slavery did not just capture individuals, it reproduced itself, generation after generation. This was not hidden. It was praised by scholars who wrote treatises on managing slaves and their offspring. It was accepted as part of law, defended as divinely sanctioned. For the empire, it created a steady supply of servants, soldiers, and concubines. For the women, it meant their wombs were turned into factories of bondage. And for the children, it meant they were born into a world where freedom was never possible. The story of sexual slavery in the Islamic world did not vanish with the past. Its shadow stretched across centuries, resurfacing in modern times. When ISIS declared its caliphate in 2014, it revived the same practices. Yazidi women and children were captured, branded, and sold in markets. ISIS fighters quoted the Quran and early Islamic jurists to justify their actions. They printed price lists for girls of different ages. They issued ID numbers for captives, tracked like property. Magazines published by ISIS celebrated sexual slavery as a divine right. Survivors described girls as young as 12, sold to fighters. Many were raped repeatedly under the belief that it was a holy act. The world was horrified, but for ISIS, this was not innovation. It was revival, a continuation of the policies that had existed since the earliest caliphates. The same logic, the same verses, the same destruction of lives. From the Abbasids to the Ottomans to ISIS, the system remained consistent. Women reduced to spoils, children stripped of innocence, communities shattered for the sake of conquest and profit. What makes this history so disturbing is not only the cruelty, it is the fact that it was celebrated, institutionalized, and sanctified for centuries. Even today, records remain hidden, softened, or denied. But the evidence survives in chronicles, in legal texts, and in the voices of survivors. Their suffering demands recognition. Their stories must be remembered. Because history is not only about monuments and victories, it is also about the victims whose voices were silenced. And if we forget them, the cycle of cruelty risks repeating again.